Thank you, Mr Speaker. With permission, I shall answer this question together with questions 2, 3 and 4. People who are instructed to self-isolate by NHS Test and Trace and are on a qualifying means-tested benefit, unable to work from home and will lose income as a result, may be entitled to a payment of £500 from their local authority.
Let's go to Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We need people to self-isolate, to control transmission and ease restrictions, yet many are continuing to work as they cannot survive on £95.85 statutory sick pay per week. The Chancellor has been asked about this on numerous occasions, and it was disappointing that nothing new was announced in his budget. Does the Minister agree that those that do not have access to occupational sick pay and can't work from home should be eligible for the test and trace support payments?
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Lady is right that many people, indeed the majority of workers, will have support from their employers above statutory sick pay. But it is for the reason she outlines that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, also announced that there will be a payment of £500 for those not qualifying for the means-tested benefit paid through the discretionary scheme that was funded at the budget to be administered by local authorities.
Let's head to Judith Cummins. Judith.
Bradford Council has the highest demand for self-isolation payments in the country, reflecting the fact that most people in our city are unable to work from home. The standard scheme for people in receipt of certain benefits is fully funded, but the discretionary scheme, which the council must use for everyone else, is not. In fact, funding for Bradford falls far short of demand. So will the Minister urgently look into this so that councils with a high demand can support all workers who need to self-isolate?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Sir. The Honourable Lady makes a fair point, which is there was a pressure in terms of the scheme for local authorities, and it's for exactly that reason my friend, the Chancellor in the budget, announced that there would be an increase to £20 million per month for the discretionary scheme. And he also listened to representations from the Honourable Lady and others in terms of widening the scope of eligibility under that scheme.
Right, let's go to Kate O'Byrne. Kate.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Government has now made available £20 million a month in discretionary self-isolation funding for local authorities, despite only making £15 million available for 4 months when the scheme first started. Because of this, hundreds of people in Blackburn have been denied support to self-isolate. Does the Minister now accept initial allocations fell well below what was needed, contributed to the rise in cases, and does he think that that's fair on my constituents?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, it is right that there was support in place, but it is also right that my right honourable friend has listened to points made by members across the House. That is why the discretionary support has been increased, and it's also why it's been extended to cover parents who are unable to work because they're caring for a child that's self-isolating and a number of other factors. I think what that shows, once again, is the willingness of this government to respond to the path of the virus, to adapt its schemes for the need, and in particular to the extensive support that is now being offered and has throughout the pandemic been offered to local authorities.
Let's head to Sharon Hodgson. Sharon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In November, my constituent was told to isolate via the NHS COVID-19 app, and she would have been eligible for the isolation payment, but as she was told to isolate via the app, she was never given an NHS Test and Trace account ID, and therefore her application could go no further. My constituent was affected financially as she couldn't work, and she's been going round in circles, even with my help, trying to access the payment. Can the Minister advise if my constituent can still access this payment retrospectively?
Minister.
Well, it's always difficult, Mr Speaker, to comment without seeing the full facts of an individual case. And I know the Honourable Lady is always an incredibly assiduous constituency member and will ensure that the case is looked at. But in terms of the specifics, I would also point to the fact that there is a wider package of support as well. So, for example, in addition to the self-isolation payments, there is, of course, for example, for self-employed workers, often eligibility through the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme. So there's a wide range of measures, but obviously it will depend on the individual case.
We now come to Chair the PAC, Meg Heather.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, Test and Trace has now been allocated £37 billion, but the head of Test and Trace, Dido Harding, Baroness Harding, has told both the Public Accounts Committee and the Science and Technology Committee that the big struggle is to get people to isolate. So although the government has provided support for people to self-isolate, surely the Chief Secretary can go back and look again to make sure that what the Treasury is providing is making sure that Test, Trace and Isolate is truly effective, or we're really not going to beat this pandemic.
Minister.
Well, the Right Honourable Lady is right in terms of the importance of test and trace. It is key to us unlocking the economy and to addressing the much more substantive costs in terms of the MPIs. And so whilst obviously, as she will know as Chair of the PAC, as I would look at as Chief Secretary, as my Right Honourable friend as Chancellor, will always look at the cost of the test and trace, the bigger prize is getting our economy opened. To the substantive point that she raises in terms of the self-isolation payments themselves, again I point to the fact that at the budget, my Right Honourable the Chancellor increased the funding for discretionary support. That sits alongside the £500 itself, and that obviously sits in addition to the wider support that the majority of employers provide.
Let's head to Shadow Minister James Murray. James.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's roadmap out of lockdown says that self-isolation is critically important to halting the spread of the disease. Yet, Baroness Harding has recently admitted that financial difficulties prevent people from self-isolating. And a year ago, the Health Secretary admitted he could not live on statutory sick pay of £94.25 a week. It is now £95.85 a week. So can the Minister explain why the Chancellor refuses simply to guarantee that anyone who has to rely on statutory sick pay or who is unable to access even that should be eligible for the £500 payment?
But Mr. Speaker, I don't think the honourable gentleman has actually read the budget announcement that was made last week, because the discretionary element of the test and trace support payments applies even if people are not in receipt of means-tested benefits. So the point is, it does recognise points raised by members of the House, which is that it is important that there isn't a disincentive for people to be tested. That's what the £500 payment through the test and trace system addresses. But in addition to that, members of the House raised cases which were just outside the means-tested element of test and trace. That is the issue that the discretionary fund addresses. It was dealt with in the budget last week.
Substantive question to Minister Bartley, number 7.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll just get to my right page. The government has provided an unprecedented multi-billion-pound package of support for Britain's charities, including £750 million of dedicated funding that has helped more than 15,000 organisations across the country to respond to the impacts of COVID-19 and to relieve the pressure on our NHS.
Let's go to Craig Whittaker. Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as we all know, yesterday marked International Women's Day, a day in which we celebrate and recognise the social, economic, cultural and political achievements of women. However, this pandemic has also shone a light on domestic abuse and the struggles of many women across the country. So could my right honourable friend set out what steps he is taking to support charities in this field so that we can ensure victims and their children can access the support they need?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend raises a very important issue, and I joined him in marking International Women's Day yesterday, and he raises a very important issue. That is why my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, at the budget last week committed a further £90 million of funding. That, of course, builds on the £125 million announced at the spending review, and indeed the earlier £25 million that had also been provided, recognising the 65% increase in calls to the National Domestic Abuse Hotline and the renewed focus within government on this important issue.
Let's go to SNP spokesperson Alison Thewlis. Alison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Charities across these islands have done amazing work through the pandemic. So with the finance bill coming up, will the Treasury reward the efforts of these charities and encourage the public to donate by temporarily increasing the rate of gift aid from 20 to 25% and expanding the small donation scheme to make gift aid much easier to claim?
Well, I join the Honourable Lady in recognising the huge contribution that charities have indeed made. In respect of specific tax measures, they were obviously dealt with by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, in the budget last week. But I do remind the Honourable Lady of the £750 million of dedicated funding that has been provided to date in recognition of that important work.
We have a substantive question to Minister Norman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Once in every Parliament, the National Infrastructure Commission publishes a National Infrastructure Assessment. The first assessment was launched on July 2018 and the Commission operates UK-wide.
Let's go to Geraint Davis. Geraint.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wales has 5% of the population, but has only had 2% of the railway enhancement investment over decades and has the lowest income, household income in Wales. So given that HS2 is not going to be passing through Wales, will the Minister and the Treasury look very carefully at providing a high-speed rail link between Bristol, Cardiff, Swansea and beyond, which has got over 3 million people living there, in line with the Burns Review, to help the agenda for levelling up and connecting the union and to give us our fair share based on need in terms of rail investment?
Well, I thank the Honourable Member for his question. Of course, he'll be aware that the benefits of HS2 are not by any means just restricted to the cities that are on its route. It's a national project of significance. More widely, Wales has done very well in the last budget, if I might remind more generally, with accelerated funded for the Swansea Bay, North Wales, Mid Wales City growth deals, money for the hydrogen hub, and of course 30 million towards the global centre of rail excellence in Neath, Port Talbot. What I would say though is that of course we do now have a UK infrastructure bank which will be looking at issues of infrastructure across the country, including in the devolved administrations.
Tom Hunt.
Question number 10, Mr. Speaker.
Chancellor.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to answer this question together with questions 11, 12 and 13. The government is providing over £407 billion worth of support for the UK economy over this year and next. Contained within that is considerable support for business through discounted loans, cash grants, VAT reductions and tax deferrals, all designed to help business get through this crisis and protect as many jobs as possible.
John Hunt. Mr. Speaker, I very much want the £25 million Ipswich should be getting through a town deal and the creation of Freeport East. 6,000 of my constituents are employed directly or indirectly through a Port of Felixstowe. The town deal will be creating a new tech campus and a maritime skills academy to feed jobs in the area, high-skilled jobs. Therefore, does the Chancellor agree that both the town deal money and the new Freeport together will be vital to the creation of new local skills in Ipswich and will therefore be crucial to supporting local business at this difficult time?
Chancellor.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I congratulate him. He's long campaigned on the importance of a town deal for his local community and indeed a Freeport. I'm delighted that this budget could deliver both of those for his constituents, and I agree with him that it will deliver growth, jobs and prosperity to his local area.
Let's send to Laura Trott. Laura.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Chancellor for his earlier response. The measures in the budget provided a lifeline to high streets in my constituency from Westham to Swanley, and in particular, the restart grants are much anticipated. Can the Chancellor confirm when local authorities will be able to begin distributing these vital grants?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right that we must get support to businesses as quickly as possible. I'm pleased to confirm to her that guidance will be published hopefully by the end of this week for local authorities, and the restart grants, which are designed to take the place of our grant scheme that runs out at the end of April, will be distributed to local authorities in the first full week, the week commencing the 5th of April. Hopefully that is a reassurance to her and her businesses, and that the local authorities can get the cash to them at this vital time.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The scale of support for businesses has been truly outstanding, but can I draw my right honourable friend's attention to the coach industry, who already found themselves pre-pandemic heavily indebted because of requirements the state put on them, such as PSVAR and Euro 6 requirements. So can I ask my right honourable friend to look again at how the coach industry can be supported given the level of debt they are already in?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for shining a spotlight on this important industry, which he is right to do so. I'll, of course, I know he'll be talking to the Department for Transport about regulations for this industry. What I can tell him is that we will be providing local authorities with discretionary funding of around £425 million to sit alongside the Restart grants, and that money at the discretion of local areas can be used to support businesses like coach businesses in their local areas.
Let's head to Mark Menzies. Mark.
Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank the Chancellor for the way in which she's engaged with myself and other members representing coastal communities throughout the lifetime of this pandemic. I know the extensive measures he's put in place, particularly for the hospitality sector, will make a huge difference to these businesses surviving. But can my right honourable friend assure me that he will continue to monitor and work with me to ensure that local businesses get all the support they need for the continued recovery?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend has been instrumental in providing on-the-ground information to me and my team about the particular situation facing hospitality businesses and coastal communities like his. He is an absolute champion for them, and rightly so. They're an important part of his local economy. I'm glad that this budget supported them, and he has my assurance that we'll continue to work with him and them to get them the support that they deserve.
Shadow Minister Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The OBR estimates that £27 billion worth of loans made under the coronavirus loan schemes will never be repaid. Why is the Chancellor insisting that banks pursue this as conventional business debt when the circumstances that gave rise to these loans are anything but conventional? Wouldn't lifting the debt burden on businesses and turning it into a contingent tax liability help to fire up the economy, set business free, and really get Britain moving again?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what we have done is provide a scheme called Pay As You Grow to give businesses incredible flexibility and generosity in how they repay bounce-back loans. Those loans at an instant can be turned automatically into 10-year loans, which reduces the monthly cash payment by almost 50%. Beyond that, there are opportunities for interest-only periods and payment holidays, all of which will support the cash flow of businesses. We do actually also have to balance the taxpayer in all of this, which is why we've taken the approach that we have, Mr. Speaker. And I'm sad that the honourable gentleman opposite didn't also welcome the £25 million of investment in his local community through a town deal at this budget, which will help local businesses there as well.
Let's head to SNP spokesperson Alison Thewlis. Alison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Save Our Salons campaign presented to the all-party group in Gaps in Support this morning, and they remain hugely frustrated that the hair, beauty and holistic service industry have had no sector-specific support from this Chancellor, despite contributing £9.2 billion to the economy. So can the Chancellor explain why he's decided to ignore the calls from this largely female industry to chop VAT to 5%?
Mr. Speaker, with regard to VAT, I'm sure the Honourable Lady knows that the majority of businesses in the personal care sector are actually below the VAT threshold, so they don't actually pay any VAT. But what we did do, Mr. Speaker, is include that sector in the more generous Restart grants, so businesses, depending on their rateable value in that sector, like those in hospitality, will be able to receive grants of up to £18,000.
Let's go to the Chair of the Treasury Committee, Mel Stride. Mel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome my right honourable friend's announcement in the budget of the super deduction, which will have definitely have a very positive impact on investment. But of course, it will primarily do that by pulling forward what would have been future investment into a more recent time period. So could I ask my right honourable friend what measures he is looking to ensure that that increase in corporate investment in the shorter term is continued into the medium and longer term?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad my honourable friend recognises the importance of the super deduction. He's right, it will bring forward investment, but I do believe it will also increase the amount of investment as well, given the attractiveness of doing so. What I would point him to are a couple of other announcements in the budget. One is a reform to our consultation to reform to our R&D tax credits regime, which we hope to conduct over the course of this year to make sure that they support investment in R&D in a way that reflects current R&D practices, and secondly, our Freeports agenda, Mr. Speaker, which contains enhanced capital allowances and structures and building allowances, which last well beyond the period of the super deduction and will serve as an incentive for capital investment in those areas for years to come. Sir. Mr. Speaker, in July of last year, the OBR forecast unemployment to peak at around 12%, just under. And now, because of policy developments, they forecast a much lower peak of 6.5%. That means 1.8 million fewer people who are expected to lose their jobs. Whether that's through interventions like the furlough scheme, we remain committed to protecting, supporting and creating jobs.
Scheme has helped protect 11.2 million jobs across the UK, including nearly 6,000 jobs in my Birmingham Northfield constituency. So can I take this opportunity to thank the Chancellor for the extension to September, and does he agree with me that this would give the businesses the vital breathing space needed in order to be able to plan as we go along the Prime Minister's roadmap?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right about the importance of protecting jobs. The extension of the furlough scheme on generous terms beyond the end of the roadmap is designed to give his local businesses and others the reassurance they need to reopen safely and confidently. I know he will be keen to protect as many of those jobs as possible in his local area, and I'm delighted that this government can support him in doing so.
Minister Bridget.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A Sage advisor is reported to have said, "I thought the Chancellor was in charge. He was the main person who was responsible for the second wave." Does the Chancellor accept that his refusal to follow the science by pitting public health against the economy led to worse outcomes for both?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd urge the Honourable Lady to be a little bit careful about what she reads in the newspaper. At all steps in this crisis, we have indeed taken the advice of our scientific advisers. If we go back to September, which I think she's referring to, at that time, as she knows from the Sage minutes herself, which are published rather than unsourced quotes in newspapers, that the evidence was finely balanced and there were many things for ministers to consider. And the consideration at that point was that the tiered system was working and deserved to be given a chance.
Substantive question to Minister Bartley.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer this question together with questions 20 and 21. I have frequent discussions with the Scottish Government Finance Minister and spoke to her ahead of the budget last week.
Let's go to Kenny McCaskill. Kenny.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite furlough, high streets face devastation, firstly shops and now pubs, and even harder space to fill. Was the budget not an opportunity to support what are community assets in urban as well as rural areas, and where alcohol consumption is supervised and not unchecked? With supermarkets having made huge profits during lockdown, much through alcohol sales, is it not time to support the Social Market Foundation's call to increase alcohol duty on the off-trade to sustain the on-trade in our communities?
Many businesses across Scotland actually argued for the alcohol freeze, not least the Scottish whisky industry. They also argued for the fuel freeze that my right honourable friend the Chancellor delivered. And I'm also surprised in terms of when he talks of community that he doesn't even recognise the extra capacity funding that his own community received that was in the budget. And with all these things that impact the community, clearly the additional £1.2 billion of funding received to the Scottish Government through the Barnett consequentials at the budget will again enable the Scottish Government to work with the UK Government to deliver better services within his community.
Let's head to Marion Fellows. Marion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Poverty Chancellor has refused to make permanent the £20 universal credit increase and apply it to legacy benefits, with 75% of those affected being disabled. If he refuses to change course, 60,000 Scots, including 20,000 children, will be left in poverty and forced to decide between heating and eating. If the Minister was in their position, what would he choose, heating or eating?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I mean, firstly, as was set out in the analysis published with the budget, the measures that this government has taken has supported the poorest working households the most. Secondly, she also failed to mention the additional capacity funding for her own community, that was announced at the budget. And thirdly, of course, the Scottish Government requested specific powers in respect of both benefits and tax, and of course has the option to use those powers that they said that they wanted.
Let's go to Amy Callaghan. Amy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister will be aware, the £20 uplift to universal credit has been a lifeline during the pandemic. Many families in my constituency are devastated this uplift is set to end in September. With the Scottish Government committed to tackling child poverty, including the game-changer Scottish Child Payment, the UK Government-imposed cliff edge could pose a significant setback. Does the Minister agree with me that plunging children and families into poverty, whether it's now or in September, is a callous act, and will he commit to a permanent uplift to universal credit?
Well, we managed to get the hat-trick, Mr. Speaker, because the Honourable Lady also received capacity funding the budget for her own area, but chose not to mention that funding that will help the families that she refers to in her question. It's slightly odd also to talk about plunging into something when my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, announced an extension, and coupled with that and the UK-wide measures that were set out at the budget, including measures such as freezing the fuel duty, which will help many families in her own constituency. Of course, there was an additional £1.2 billion of funding for the Scottish Government, and the powers to which I referred in my answer previously. So many families have been helped, including 480,000 existing claimants in Scotland, as well as new claimants, as well as those families helped through the £500 one-off payment that was announced at the budget. So there was a strong package of support for Scotland, none of which she chose to mention in her question.
Substantive question to Minister Norman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'd like to answer this question together with questions 23, 24 and 25. Improving transport connectivity across the UK is central to the government's levelling up agenda. Across the UK will benefit from upgrades to infrastructure that improve everyday life as a result of the launch of the £4.8 billion levelling up fund. The government's also maintained its commitment to already announced transport investment through the Transforming Cities Fund and Roads Investment Strategy. And as my honourable friend will be aware, the Budget 2021 confirmed capacity funding allocations for the £4.2 billion of intra-city transport settlements, so that city regions receiving settlements can develop investment-ready transport plans to deliver on local priorities.
Let's go to Robert Largood. Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Politicians of all parties have been promising to build the Mottram bypass for over 50 years. Now, I'm really pleased that Highways England and Balfour Beatty recently signed a contract to build the bypass, and a formal consultation has now been carried out on the detailed proposals, meaning that we're closer than we've ever been before to finally getting it built. Can the Minister assure me that the government remains committed to building the bypass as soon as possible? The people of Glossop and Hatfield have waited long enough.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and of course he's been a very vociferous supporter of this scheme, and I can very happily confirm to him that the government remains committed to upgrading the A57 so as to improve connectivity between Manchester and Sheffield. The DCO, the Development Consent Order, is on track to be submitted shortly, and construction is expected to start in early 2023.
Let's go to Sally Ann Hart. Sally Ann.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Investing in improved transport infrastructure is well recognised by this government as a necessity for turbocharging our economy and levelling up. Beautiful Hastings and Rye has some of the most antiquated road and rail infrastructure in the country, which discourages new businesses from locating there and inhibits economic growth. Network Rail is currently finalising a strategic business case for HS1. What steps is my honourable friend taking to ensure that funding will be available to finance such a vital project?
Thank you. As the honourable lady will be aware, the strategic outline business case for the Kent and East Sussex Coastal Connectivity Scheme includes proposals to extend HS1 services from Ashford International to Hastings and Rye, and it is currently being taken forward by Network Rail and is due to be submitted to the Department for Transport in April 2021. It will then be reviewed by the Department and, of course, by stakeholders also in Kent and East Sussex County Councils.
Let's head to Simon Jupp. Simon.
Improving road and rail connections across all 4 nations of the UK will improve the quality of life for our communities, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the Henley Review this summer. However, there's no doubt that it will take the aviation sector longer than most to recover from the crisis. Taxes, including air passenger duty, need urgent reform to help the industry back on its feet. What plans does the Treasury have to remove the double charging of domestic APD, a call backed by regional airports, including Exeter in my constituency, and Newquay, who particularly rely on domestic flights to all corners of the United Kingdom?
To consult on aviation tax reform, and as part of that we will consider the APD treatment of domestic flights. Unfortunately, consultation has been delayed in recognition of the rather challenging circumstances that the aviation industry is currently facing, but we will update the House on this in due course.
Let's go to Alexander Stafford. Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Maltby in Rother Valley has a lower than national average car ownership, and buses provide a vital lifeline. However, our services are severely lacking. You cannot get a direct bus between Maltby, my largest town, and Dinnington, my second largest town. And if you do take public transport, this 5-mile journey takes almost an hour. What physical steps is my right honourable friend taking to ensure that communities in Rother Valley are linked up so that those without cars have the same opportunities to be economically active, either by getting to or from jobs or even for shopping, as those with cars?
Well, it's no secret that bus services are close to the Prime Minister's heart, and the government has committed to improving bus services and supported operators with over £1 billion of funding since the start of the pandemic, as well as £120 million at the spending review for the delivery of new zero-emission buses. The National Bus Strategy is due to be published soon and will start to set out this wider ambition. I'm also pleased to note that Budget 2020 allocated £166 million to Sheffield City region from the Transforming Cities Fund to support local transport investment, including bus infrastructure.
Let's go to Shadow Minister Abana Pongasari. Abana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To deliver transport connectivity in every part of the United Kingdom, we need a long-term investment in infrastructure. But staggeringly, the OBR analysis reveals that the Chancellor has actually cut capital investment plans by £500 million since last March. The budget also made no mention of the Northern Powerhouse Rail and slashed the transport for the North budget by 40%. Can the Minister explain why the reality of the budget on the infrastructure investment is so far from this government's rhetoric?
Well, I must say, Mr. Speaker, that I don't recognise the figures the Honourable Lady has used at all. The facts are that this government published a national infrastructure strategy in November, and that set out plans for £300 billion worth of public investment over the next few years, and as well as supporting £300 billion of private investment. And of course, to that, since then, the Chancellor has announced the new UK Infrastructure Bank, which will further support the development of infrastructure and levelling up, and the development of our green infrastructure across the UK.
We now have a substantive question to Minister Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor regularly engages with his international partners in the G7, the G20 and the Paris Club on debt issues, including private sector participation in debt restructurings, and Treasury officials are also engaging with the private sector on this issue.
Let's go to Mary Kelly-Ford. Mary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the government slashes international aid, COVID-19 could push up to 150 million people globally into extreme poverty. Yet many banks and asset managers operating in the UK, including HSBC, BlackRock and JP Morgan, continue to demand debt repayments from developing countries, leaving them with less money to respond to COVID-19. Will the government urgently introduce new legislation to prevent developing countries being sued in UK courts by banks, asset managers and vulture funds if they're unable to pay their debts as a result of the pandemic?
I note the Honourable Lady's long-standing interest in this subject, but I want to state very clearly that the government supports that the role of the low-income developing countries to be supported by the UK's G7 presidency. And we have made clear our expectation that the private sector and the firms that she mentioned will offer debt treatment on at least as favourable terms as the official sector under the common framework as agreed by the G20 last November?
Substantive question to the Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In order to support people through the next stages of the pandemic, the government has extended both the furlough scheme and the self-employment income support scheme through to September, which will help millions of people up and down the country.
Stephen Doherty. Stephen.
I thank the Chancellor for his answer. The Welsh Labour government this week announced a further 30 million to support hospitality and tourism, and freelancers working in our creative sectors are going to get a further round of support worth 8.9 million, targeting support fill gaps which have been left by the Chancellor. I accept many people have had welcome support, but huge numbers of people are coming up to a year of little or no support because they were excluded from UK government support over the past year. What will the Chancellor do for all of those excluded, left out and left behind the curve over the past year?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the Welsh Government will receive over £740 million in Barnett consequentials as a result of this budget, which works for the whole United Kingdom, Mr. Speaker. With regard to the self-employment scheme, what I can say is that we are now able to bring in those people who filed tax returns for the first time in the tax year 1920. This was something that many colleagues asked for. Pleased that we were able to deliver that now that the tax deadline has passed, and that means over 600,000 more people will be able to benefit from this world-leading support for self-employed.
Substantive question to Minister Norman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I would like to answer this question together with question number 30. The government's announced that the self-employment income support scheme will continue until September with a fourth and a fifth grant. This provides certainty to business as the economy reopens, and it means that the self-employment income support scheme continues to be one of the most generous COVID-19 support schemes for self-employment income around the world.
Let's go to Andrew Gwynn. Andrew.
That's welcome for those who qualify for it. But a year ago, it was the Chancellor who said he would do whatever it takes to protect people. But there are still millions of self-employed people without any support since this crisis started, and they won't forget that either. It's untenable. So why won't ministers finally act and do whatever it takes to ensure this important sector of the economy also has the chance to succeed post the pandemic?
Gentleman's question. Of course, we've put in place £407 billion worth of support across the whole of the pandemic, which is an astonishing level of support for a very, very wide range of businesses and people across the country. In relation to the self-employed, he may not be aware, but I have bent over backwards to engage with different groups of the self-employed repeatedly across different meetings. We have looked with the greatest care at the proposals that they've put forward to bring in people who may not be able to qualify at the moment. And as the Chancellor mentioned, 600,000 people previously ineligible may now be eligible, including those newly self-employed in 1920.
Let's go to Yasmin Qureshi. Yasmin.
The government may well throw these figures about, but we know that 3.8 million self-employed people have had no financial support throughout this whole pandemic. Freelancers, small companies, and other people across Bolton and this country want the Chancellor to recognise the fact that his continued silence is just not good enough.
Well, in mentioning Bolton, the Honourable Lady somehow neglected to mention the £22.9 million worth of Towns funding that Bolton's recently received. I thought she might kick off with that. Look, the answer I gave is perfectly clear about the matter. We are bending over backwards to support people. We have lent into this issue as hard as we can, and we will continue to do so.
We have a substantive question to Minister Bennell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Chancellor reaffirmed at budget, the government is increasing the national living wage by 2.2% from £8.72 to £8.91, an above inflation pay rise. The government remains committed to its ambitious target for the national living wage to reach 2/3 of median earnings by 2024, provided economic conditions allow. The Treasury will continue to work closely with Cabinet colleagues to ensure we reach this target.
Let's go to John Barron. John.
Speaker, in welcoming the government's generous economic support packages and the increase in the national living wage, Can I just ask the Minister to consider further increasing it ahead of inflation in the years ahead in order to help achieve our One Nation agenda and ensure work pays? I suggest, combined with an effective and controlled immigration policy, this will also encourage businesses to invest in their workforce and in R&D generally, which will help improve productivity.
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and he should know that this government remains committed to ensuring work pays and helping to end low pay. And as he notes, investment to raise productivity is vital for long-term sustainable growth in wages. And I'm sure that the request which he is making is one which we will consider, as always, in future budgets. Taxes and minimum wages are always under review, but this government is absolutely focused on levelling up, and we've set out our plan to build back better, which will drive economic growth that levels up the whole of the UK through significant investment in infrastructure as well as skills and innovation.
Substantive question to the Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Taking into account all the measures announced since last March, this government is providing over £400 billion worth of direct fiscal support to the economy over this year and next, and that will rank as one of the most comprehensive and generous responses of any country anywhere in the world.
David Simmons. David.
People and a further support announced for businesses, the extension of the VAT cut and the business rates holiday, alongside the restart grants, are particularly welcome with businesses in my constituency of Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, and especially our high streets. Does my right honourable friend agree that these steps will support our short-term economic recovery, and in particular ensure businesses have the breathing space to protect jobs as they begin to bounce back?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. Our priority economically is to protect, support and create as many jobs as possible, and the support that we've provided to businesses will help do that. My honourable friend talks about breathing space. He's right. The measures to improve businesses' cash flow in the short term will help give them the breathing space they need to drive our recovery as they begin to reopen in the coming months.
We now come to topicals, Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, last week I presented to the House a budget to protect the jobs and livelihoods of the British people, confirming over £400 billion of support over this year and next, ranking as one of the most comprehensive responses of any country anywhere in the world. We also set out a fair and honest plan, Mr. Speaker, to begin fixing our public finances, whilst also starting the work of building our future economy.
Let's go to Stephen Timms. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How are the crucial EU negotiations on the Memorandum of Understanding on Financial Services progressing, given its importance to the UK economy? By comparison, for example, with fishing, why wasn't it included in the overall deal?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can't comment on ongoing negotiations, but we remain committed to constructive dialogue with our European partners regarding the Memorandum of Understanding. I can confirm those discussions are underway. With regard to financial services, Mr. Speaker, I hope the right honourable gentleman saw the announcement of our listings review, and I thank Jonathan Hill for his excellent work. We will take forward those reforms together with the FCA to ensure that the UK remains one of the most attractive places anywhere in the world for companies to raise the finance they need to power their future growth.
Dr. Julian.
Many thanks, Mr. Speaker. The food and drink wholesalers on whom the hospitality industry depends are still excluded from business rates relief, and the additional restriction grants, which do help some of them substantially, are awarded entirely at the discretion of individual local authorities. Can that particular postcode lottery be replaced by a directive to ensure much greater consistency in awarding these vital grants?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know my right honourable friend has raised this industry with me multiple times, and he's right to do so. What I'd say is, while some food and drink wholesalers have been significantly impacted, others, for example, those who serve predominantly the public sector have not been. So it wouldn't be fair, I think, to provide blanket support. And he talked about a postcode lottery. I guess the other side of that coin is empowering local government and local decision making. I do believe that's the right approach, and we've announced £425 million of additional discretionary support to local authorities, but I'm sure that his raising it in the House in this way will give his local council and others the steer they need to direct support to this important industry.
Chancellor and the least.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2017, the Chancellor asked a member of this House if Labour's proposed increase in our corporation tax would make it more or less likely that international investors would want to invest here in the UK. What's the answer, Chancellor?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted that the Honourable Lady is raising the topic of corporation tax at this budget. I feel that we have had various different versions of the Labour Party policy on this topic over the past couple of weeks. What I can say is, Mr. Speaker, we are honest with the British people about the challenges facing our public finances. We set out a fair and honest way to address those challenges. This will remain one of the most internationally competitive places anywhere in the world to invest, to grow a business and to create jobs, and this government will always deliver on that promise.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Chancellor said he wanted to level with the public. He just mentioned a moment ago that he wants to take an honest approach. Well, the head of the NHS just did by confirming that he budgeted for the 2.1% pay rise that nurses expected. We need a straight answer now from the Chancellor. Why do the Conservatives believe our nurses are worth less now than they were before the pandemic?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to all of those working on the front line of our NHS and other public services. They are doing a fantastic job, and that's why this government has supported the NHS with tens of billions of pounds of extra funding through this pandemic and will continue to do so. With regard to public sector pay, Mr. Speaker, we set out a policy in November, but given the situation, we were taking a more targeted approach to public sector pay to balance fairness and to protect as many jobs as possible. The Honourable Lady will know that the NHS was exempted from that policy, and NHS workers will receive a pay rise next year.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning I spoke to a roundtable of businesses from across the country, and there was much positivity for the restart grants and the business rates holiday, which will help open up our high streets. But many of the businesses I speak to still speak of the need for long-term reform of the business rate system. So would my right honourable friend be able to update the House on the outcome of the consultation that was carried out last year and what the long-term aspiration for business rates reform is?
Well, my honourable friend is right to raise this important issue, as he has done with me on behalf of his local businesses several times. And he's right that we are reviewing business rates. We're in the midst of that process. I can say the next stage of that will be a publication of all the consultation responses that we have received, which will happen shortly, and we will take forward the policy process over the course of this year. There were many options that we outlined, the potential reforms in the paper. I look forward to receiving from him some ideas on what the reforms might be, and in the short term, we're providing a £6 billion tax cut on business rates, delivering a 75% discount to business rates for the vast majority of small and medium-sized businesses as they emerge from this pandemic.
Mr. Speaker, every year of delay to integrated rail improvements in the Midlands and the North means a missed £5 billion boost for our economy, as well as delaying the addition of 150,000 jobs. The Chancellor's Build Back Better plan promises the long-awaited integrated rail plan within 3 months. Will he confirm that this is an absolute maximum and that he or one of his ministers will meet with me and regional businesses to hear more about our exciting plans for our community?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to record amounts of investment in infrastructure, both road and rail, as we heard from my colleague, the Financial Secretary, earlier. And with regard to the Midlands, Mr. Speaker, the budget announced upgrades for several stations in and around the Midlands after representations that we heard from the fantastic Mayor, Andy Street, about the needs of his area. And we remain committed to publishing the integrated rail plan in due course.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend has been rightly open with the House and the public about the scale of the challenge to the public finances. But on a point of detail, further to the assumptions in the Red Book, can I ask my right honourable friend whether his department plans to undertake dynamic scoring of the changes to corporation tax akin to the previous detailed CGE modelling since 2010 and confirm whether those will be published in full?
Well, what a fantastically niche question, and how delighted I am to be able to answer that from the honourable member. I mean, he will know that scoring is a matter of the OBR. At the budget, as the budget policy costings document in the budget 2021 set out, the costing for corporation tax has been adjusted to reflect behavioural responses to an increase in the rate of corporation tax. It's important to be clear that, of course, dynamic scoring can include a number of potential behavioural responses, and they can include adjustments to reflect the impact on the incentive to incorporate, on profit shifting, and on investment. If the honourable gentleman is so minded, further detail can be found on page 196 of the OBR's Economic and Fiscal Outlook.
Let's go to Paul Blomfield. Paul.
Mr. Speaker, as some students return to campus this week, those studying in Northern Ireland will receive £500 support each. The Welsh Government's provided hardship funding equivalent to over £300 per student. In Scotland, £80, but for those studying in England, hardship funds equate to just £36. So does the Chancellor not accept the case for equal support across the UK? Students have lost vital income from part-time jobs, paid rent on unused accommodation and faced other costs. So will you meet with the APPG for students to discuss our recommendations for hardship support and funding to make up for missed learning opportunities?
I'm always happy to meet with the honourable gentleman and to discuss that in more detail. As he will recognise, one of the features of the budget was the number of UK-wide measures. But at the same time, he's quite right to point to the additional £2.4 billion of one consequential fundings that were allocated to the devolved administrations, which has enabled them to apply further support as a result of the fiscal strength that is offered by UK Treasury. But of course, I'm happy to discuss the specific point with him in more detail.
Let's go to Pauline Latham. Pauline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend said the day after the comprehensive spending review that the government were looking at when they will bring forward legislation to do with the 0.7% of GNI. And I wondered if he could update us what the government's timescale is now for bringing forward the legislative proposals to reduce that 0.7% of GNI annual aid spending target to 0.5%.
I thank the honourable lady for her question. The Foreign Secretary is continuing to look very carefully at the legislative requirements and will set out further detail on how the government intends to proceed in due course.
Let's go to Kenny McCaskill. Kenny.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the government is unwilling to support the licensed trade through varying duty rates, there is another fiscal policy to sustain hard-pressed pubs in our communities. Italy has reduced VAT on alcohol sales in pubs and restaurants. Should that not be replicated here, sustaining public revenue while supporting consumption of alcohol in supervised premises and maintaining community assets in our towns and villages?
I thank the honourable member for his question. He will know that we are carrying out an alcohol duty review, which will be looking at all of these decisions in the round. And I'm very happy to speak with him specifically about any particular schemes or requests that he has in more detail.
We now go to Stuart Anderson. Stuart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If every working adult in Wolverhampton spent £5 a week extra with local businesses like Mode Menswear and Tony's Deli, it would boost the local economy by around £780,000 a week. What is my right honourable friend doing to ensure that local independent shops and city centre businesses can bounce back from COVID-19 in Wolverhampton?
Mr. Speaker, the government is supporting these businesses through new restart grants, a one-off cash grant of up to £6,000 per business premises for non-essential retailers in England, and up to £18,000 for hospitality and leisure businesses. They will also benefit from a 5-month extension to the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, a further 12 months relief from business rates, and a new UK-wide recovery loan scheme. Tony's Deli, which my honourable friend mentioned, and other business serving hot food can also enjoy a 12-month VAT cut at 5% until the end of September and at 12.5% until the end of March.
Let's go to Ian Lavery, who's audio only. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this week, there was an attempt by the Health Minister to justify the incredibly insulting 1% pay offer to our nurses by contrasting it with the government-imposed pay freeze on our heroic essential key workers. That's a pay freeze on 2.5 million public servants. Can the Chancellor confirm when he'll recognise their worth, do the right thing and announce the lifting of the pay freeze?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I would say is a majority of those working in the public sector will see an increase in their pay this forthcoming year as a result of our pay policy. And importantly, those earning less than the median UK salary will receive a £250 increase in their pay because we want to protect those on the lowest incomes, even at a difficult time. That's what this government is committed to doing.
Ben Evans.
The Treasury front bench is no doubt aware of my support for a brand new university for Milton Keynes focused on STEM and digital skills, so vital for our future economy. But I wonder, Mr. Speaker, if they are aware that we're already home to the Open University, which is a pioneer of modular learning, which is upskilling, reskilling, important for our future economy. The budget last week announced support for further education and skills. Will this apply to institutions like the Open University?
Mr. Speaker, we are committed to improving skills in the economy and levelling up productivity across England. This will be achieved through our lifetime skills guarantee and further reforms which will create jobs and opportunity across the country, supporting us to build back better from the coronavirus pandemic. We will provide further detail and a full conclusion to the review of post-18 education and funding at the next comprehensive spending review. And I would like to thank my honourable friend and the Open University for their engagement on this so far.
Let's go to Zara Sultan. Zara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The disgraceful 1% pay rise for NHS workers is really a pay cut when inflation is factored in. The Prime Minister claims it's all we can afford, but he had no problem finding £37 billion for the private test and trace system, an extra £16 billion for the military budget, or hundreds of millions of pounds in dodgy COVID contracts for the Health Secretary's WhatsApp contacts. NHS workers have seen their pay fall by more than 10% in real terms in the past decade. So instead of handing out fortunes to mates and donors, will the Chancellor heed the calls of trade unions and NHS staff and give them the pay rise that they deserve? That's 15% to make up for a decade of lost pay.
Well, Mr. Speaker, with respect, the Honourable Lady is just simply wrong on the facts with her question. Under the Agenda for Change 3-year award, the nurse average increase this year was 2.5%, not the fall that she alluded to. But of course, the government has asked the pay review body to consider a number of factors, and as is normal practice, the Department for Health has set out what figure is affordable within their budgets.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government recently confirmed the first 8 sites to be awarded Freeport status. This will provide great opportunities for prosperity in those areas. In my home constituency of Blythe Valley, we have the only deep water port in Northumberland, and with investments in offshore wind such as Catapult as well as British Volt, the only gigaplant in the UK. What assessment does my right honourable friend make of granting a second round of bidding for areas such as Blythe that weren't successful on this occasion?
Mr. Speaker, free ports will be national hubs for international trade, innovation and commerce, and they will regenerate communities across the UK. MHCLG led a fair, open and transparent selection process to determine successful free port locations in England. Unfortunately, as with any competitive process, there will always be those that are unsuccessful, and I'm afraid there are no plans to designate further free ports in England. Free ports are part of a wider package of UK government support, which invest in skills, infrastructure and innovation at local, regional and national levels. And as part of that package, Blythe was awarded £11 million through the Future High Street Fund in December and is also one of 101 towns eligible for up to £25 million funding from the Towns Fund.
Let's go to Nick Fletcher. Nick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With Doncaster missing out on its Freeport bid, what other incentives does my right honourable friend believe there are for businesses to locate to the town?
The government is committed to encouraging business investment in Doncaster and its surrounding area, and at the budget we confirmed £23 million funding for Goldthorpe's town deal just due west of the town, and that will boost economic growth and encourage business investment in the area. MHCLG is currently assessing the remaining 49 town fund bids, including those from Doncaster and Stainforth, and we will make further announcements on those in due course.
I am suspending the House for 3 minutes to enable the necessary arrangements for the next business to be made. Order. Order. I call Rachel Reeves to ask the urgent question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster if he will make a statement on the recent court order regarding the government's publication of contracts during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While not the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, I hope the Honourable Lady will nonetheless allow me to respond to her urgent question. Mr. Speaker, the first duty of any government in a crisis is protecting its citizens. And so our work to provide PPE was a critical part of our response. And that was a Herculean effort that involved setting up a new logistics network from scratch and expanding our PPE supply chain from 226 NHS trusts in England to over 58,000 different settings. Our team had been working night and day on this vital national effort, and I can update the House that we've now delivered over 8.8 billion items of PPE to those who need it. This work was taking place at a time when global demand was greater than ever before and when rapid action was required. So we've had to work at unprecedented pace to get supplies to our front line and to the public. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, in response to an urgent question from the Honourable Lady, I updated the House on the initial High Court ruling. And I won't set out that judgment at length once again. Save to say that it was not a case that looked at the awarding of the contracts, but rather delays in publishing the details of those contracts, as we responded to one of the greatest threats to public health this country has ever seen. The Honourable Lady's question refers to a short declaratory judgment handed down subsequent to the original judgment in this matter, which makes a formal order as to the government's compliance with the relevant regulatory rules. As before, I reiterate that, of course, we take the judgment of the court very seriously and respect it. We have always been clear that transparency is vital, and the court itself has found that there was no deliberate policy to delay publication. Mr. Speaker, the fight against COVID-19 is ongoing, and you would expect we are agreeing new contracts as part of that fight all the time, and we will keep publishing details on those as we move forward. Mr. Speaker, I care passionately about transparency, and so does everyone in my department. We will continue, of course, looking at how we can improve our response while we tackle one of the greatest threats to our public health this nation has ever seen.
Secretary Rachel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This question and the answers to it really matter because our frontline workers were not adequately protected with the high-quality PPE that they needed during the course of this pandemic. And it matters because it is essential that taxpayers' money is spent effectively and fairly, not handed out to those who happen to have close links with the party of government. The government ran down the PPE stockpile ahead of this pandemic, and it came back to haunt us when we needed it most. Contracts were handed out, many to friends and donors of the Conservative Party, without any transparency. The Good Law Project took the government to court, and on the 19th of February, the High Court ruled that the government had acted unlawfully, saying, and I quote, "The public were entitled to see who this money was going to and what it was being spent on, and how the contracts were awarded." 3 days later, on the 22nd of February, in this House, the Prime Minister said, and I quote again, "The contracts are there on the record for everybody to see." But they're not. A judge confirmed through a court order last Friday that 100 contracts are still to be published. So will the Minister now take this opportunity to apologise for that statement and to put the record straight? And will the government now finally agree to publish all 100 outstanding contracts by the end of this week? And for contracts that have failed, will the Minister tell us how much money has and will be clawed back for taxpayers? Can the Minister tell us which businesses were on the VIP fast lane for getting government contracts and how they got there? And finally, Mr. Speaker, can the Minister honestly tell our brilliant NHS nurses, now facing a pay cut, that the government has not wasted a single penny of their money on this curious incident of the missing contracts?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. It's a pleasure once again to be up opposite her at this dispatch box 2 weeks after we last did so, and I will endeavour to do my best to answer not just from my own department, but indeed more broadly on the question she raises across government. She raised a number of points. She's right to say that transparency matters. Of course, she's absolutely right, because transparency of procurement, transparency in government is one of the foundations of the trust that is so vital to our democracy. And that is why we are working flat out to ensure that as new contracts are awarded, the CANs, the contract award notices, and other relevant pieces of information are published in line with the requirements of regulations. What matters, I believe, most, though, and is most important, is to recognise, Mr. Speaker, the situation we faced last year with rising infection rates, rising hospitalisation rates, and the need to do everything we could to strain every sinew, I think, to quote from one of her letters to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster at the time, to make sure that we got for the front line what it needed to keep those working flat out safe. And I would pay tribute to the officials in my department who did exactly that. They focused on getting what was needed in bulk in an incredibly challenging global market to make sure that PPE did not run out. To the judgment, she quoted from the judgment, quite rightly. I would also quote from the judgment in terms of transparency, paragraph 149, the original judgment, not the supplementary judgment, where the judge, Mr. Justice Chamberlain, stated, "The overall picture shows the Secretary of State moving close to complete compliance. The evidence as a whole suggests that the backlog arose largely in the first few months of the pandemic, and officials began to bear down on it during the autumn of 2020. So that recognises, I think, the efforts that have been put in place to ensure that we meet our transparency requirements, and 100% of the department's CANs, contract award notices, have been published. She asked a particular question, and I hope she will allow me to answer that, where she referred to my right honourable friend and his comments, I think, on the 22nd, if I'm correct in what I'm surmising from her. My right honourable friend was responding to a question around the failure to publish the details of specific contracts which are subject to judicial reviews. At the time of his statement, the details for all of these contracts under scrutiny, I'm advised, were published.
Right. Let us go to Nigel Mills. Nigel.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the co-chair of the all-party group on anti-corruption, I think the government following robust procurement measures is absolutely critical. But clearly a year ago, we weren't in normal circumstances, and I think most reasonable people would accept that desperate times called for desperate measures at that time. Could you confirm that the government are now following all normal standard procurement processes? And would you confirm what percentage of the contracts have been fully published from a year ago and when the remainder will be?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend. He highlights the situation we faced at the time, while quite rightly highlighting the importance of transparency and complying with all transparency processes. We invoked Regulation 32 as a government, which recognised the exceptional circumstances which allowed for procurement without the usual tender process. I believe that the usual tender process could take, at a minimum, 25 days. He recalls and he highlights the situation at the time. We did what we felt was right as a government to ensure we got the PPE that our front line needed. But the court case also found there was no policy to deprioritise compliance with transparency regulations, and I can give him the assurance he seeks that the government is doing everything possible to ensure we fully comply with those going forward.
Let's go to SNP spokesperson Stuart Hosey. Stuart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 94% of contracts awarded before the 7th of October unlawfully not published in time. 100 as of late last week, still not published. 58% awarded without a competitive tender process. Conflicts of interest, inadequate documentation, a high priority crony lane, and then the Prime Minister announcing all of the contracts were on the record for everyone to see, which, when he said it, was simply not correct. Is the Minister not concerned that this failure in transparency, potential conflicts of interest, that the Prime Minister doesn't even appear to know what's going on, simply feeds a perception of a government doing profitable deals with friends and cronies rather than delivering meaningful transparency, which will actually drive value for money for the taxpayer?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. He does highlight quite accurately the 94% figure, which was cited in the subsequent judgment and the order that flowed from it, of those that were late in publication. And we accept that that is a statement of fact. We have published, the department has published 100% of department's cans that it is obliged to do which related to this matter. He talked about those that were, or the percentage that were procured without following a normal competitive tendering process, and I think he referred to 58% as the percentage that were procured. That is something that is entirely appropriate under Regulation 32, recognising the situation we faced at the time and the priority of this government to make sure that at pace we got the PPE that our front line needed to keep it safe. And to his final 2 points, I do not see in these judgments in this case or in any of the other scrutiny of this by committees of this House or by other organisations anything that asserts or finds that inappropriate conflicts of interests influenced how these contracts were awarded. And to his final point, I'm proud to serve in a government led by a Prime Minister who leads from the front and has done whatever is necessary to make sure this country gets through this pandemic.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This time last year, there was a desperate need to urgently secure PPE when almost overnight it became one of the most hotly sought after commodities globally. And I congratulate the Herculean efforts of departments to keep my residents safe and get them the PPE they needed when the shortage hit. Of course, delays to publication are not ideal, and I'm glad the department's doing urgently trying to resolve this. But would my honourable friend agree with me that as part of the review into the pandemic, we need to look at how procurement procedures can be improved when responding to a national crisis or indeed future pandemics?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I would pay tribute to him and his work on this issue. He is a strong and vocal champion for the NHS and for those who work in it. To his substantive points, in terms of the context he sets, he's absolutely right, and I will quote from the summary of the NAO report, without making a value judgment on it, but I quote from that, where it highlighted in paragraph 2, demand for PPE rocketed in England from March, and goes on to say there was also a surge in demand in other countries. At the same time, the global supply of PPE declined as a result of a fall in exports from China, the country that manufactures most PPE, in February. That's a statement of fact, and I think that just highlights the context in which we were operating. But to his final point, he's absolutely right. Any government, and all governments, quite rightly, should look at what they have done, what lessons they can learn, and how they can always learn the lessons of those to ensure they're well prepared for future events.
Let us go to Caroline Lucas. Caroline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 22nd of February, the Prime Minister answered my question about unpublished COVID contracts by claiming, and I quote, "As for the contracts, all the details are on the record." 2 days later, when the Minister was dragged to this chamber, he didn't tell us about the 100 contracts which were still not on the record. We had to wait for the High Court to reveal that last Friday. So are we expected to believe the Prime Minister had not sought any briefing after the High Court had found his Secretary of State had acted unlawfully? And if he sought no facts, why did he give such a categorical yet wildly inaccurate reply? And why was that inaccurate reply not corrected 2 days later by the Minister here today?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Grateful to the Honourable Lady. At the point in time she's referring to, I think, again, if I recall, I said to the Honourable Lady, the 22nd was, I think, when she asked the Prime Minister her question. At that point in time, I understand that we had, in fact, published 100% of our contract award notices for contracts of the department which were subject to the court case, and I believe the Prime Minister spoke accurately.
Let's go to Marco Longi. Marco. Right, in which case, let's go to Jeremy. There we are, Marco. Come on board.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Notwithstanding the answer my honourable friend gave to the member for Runnymede just a few moments ago, will he agree with me that my Dudley North constituents and I, that during a national emergency, the British people want a government that focuses resources on saving lives over the privatising of red tape?
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend, he makes the point on behalf of his constituents. The overwhelming priority was to make sure that we got the PPE in the quantities we needed to our front line, and we procured that in an incredibly challenging environment. As I say, I pay tribute to all the officials who worked flat out in doing that. The court judgment found that there was no policy of deprioritisation of meeting transparency requirements, but it also found, as a matter of fact, which is clear in the judgment, that that bar was not met. That is something we have worked very hard on subsequently and continue to ensure that transparency requirements are met going forward.
Chair of the PSC, Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it feels a bit like Groundhog Day. Once again, we have the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, overall responsible for procurement, missing in action. We have the Health Minister come to this House to talk about how breathlessly urgent it all was at the beginning of the pandemic, which I don't disagree with, but that doesn't give an excuse for not publishing these contracts in time. With over £10 billion done without tender action between the beginning of the pandemic and July, the urgency to see that paperwork is more important, not less. So if the paperwork is still not being published in time, and even just going back to the old problems we discussed 2 weeks ago, can't the Minister just apologise and give a very firm commitment that from now on every contract will be published in time, because either it's insouciance or incompetence that they weren't in the first place?
Minister.
Thank you. Well, I won't. I've known the honourable lady since I came to this House, so I won't take it personally that she's just I'm not the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, but I will none, and that in some way diminishes the import of the answers that I am going to give. I will endeavour to answer her specific questions. As I make clear, we have published 100% of the CANs, the contract award notices, which give the information on the contracts awarded in the context of this case by contracts awarded by the Department of Health and Social Care. But she asked a very fair question at the end about the future. And I can give her the reassurance that this department is doing everything possible to ensure that it does meet those transparency requirements. Officials are aware of them, officials are reminded of them, and I recognise the vital importance of transparency, not least for building trust, which she mentioned last time, I think, in her question, but also in allowing her, the NAO and other members of this House to do their job quite rightly in scrutinising and challenging those contracts and government decisions where appropriate.
Sir John Redwood.
I'm quite sure that ministers want these published, and I look forward to the remaining publications. Will he confirm that in the emergency phase, when it was just desperate to get hold of PPE, that all those contracts were negotiated and vetted by independent professional civil servants, and this was not a case of friends of ministers?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy to say he's absolutely right. He has a lot of experience in government and in this sort of space. All those contracts and all those assessments of contracts, whichever route they came in via, went through the 8-stage process of being assessed by independent civil servants who know commerce, who know procurement, and I would not for a moment cast aspersions on their judgment, and ministers did not determine which contracts were or were not awarded in that context.
Munira Wilson. Munira.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Given the number of fast-track VIP COVID contracts that have resulted in unusable protective equipment, will the Minister commit to recovering public money from the companies which did not meet their contractual obligations? And would he agree that those hundreds of millions of pounds might have been better spent on a decent pay rise for the NHS workforce?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable lady. She does make an important point in terms of contracts that either failed to deliver or where PPE, for example, did not meet the required standards. And I can reassure her that we are undertaking a stocktake and an audit exactly of that, and we are already pursuing a number of cases where if PPE was either not to the required standard or was not delivered, we will recoup the money from that.
Let's go to Gagan Mahindra. Gagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The court's judgment focused solely on the publication of contract notices. It did not make any judgment on the contracting process or any of the individual processes in any way. Does my honourable friend agree that the opposition are wrong to play politics and misrepresent the court's opinion in this way?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend. He does highlight something that is important, which is actually what the court did and didn't consider. It considered, quite rightly, whether the government met the simple binary were the notices published within the required time frame, and found that it didn't. It did, however, find against the claimants and in favour of the government that there was no policy of deprioritising transparency and publication requirements. And as he says, the court did not find any judgment or make any judgment on the appropriateness of the awards or the process followed for those awards.
Jim Shan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I, first of all, I know the Minister to be a person of integrity and openness. Indeed, this is an opportunity for government to show this. Would the Minister once again outline the intention for a timely publication in line with the comprehensive JR judgment, and does the Minister have any update on any monies that government have been able to recoup from contracts that were unusable or were incorrect?
Minister.
I can give my honourable friend, the honourable gentleman, the reassurance I've given to other honourable members. We recognise entirely the importance of transparency. We will comply fully with the court judgment and the court order, and going forward we will comply with the requirements around transparency. To his specific point, I alluded there to the stock take that we are doing the audit to make sure if anything was not delivered or was faulty, we can recoup it. And I would say more broadly, the Department has cancelled or curtailed contracts up to the value of around £400 million so far, and I think that was in the evidence given to the Honourable Ladies Committee by the second permanent secretary of the department, I believe, and cancellation of those contracts, hasten to add, has occurred for a multitude of reasons, not necessarily representative of faulty or inadequate PPE, but I hope it gives him an indication of the work the government is doing to ensure value for money.
Let's go to Suzanne Webb. Suzanne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is it not important to remember that over the course of this pandemic, we have created the largest diagnostic network in British history, delivering around 90 million tests and contacting over 9 million people who would otherwise have spread the virus? Does my right honourable friend agree that our ability to set up this network is a testament to the hard work and dedication of our frontline health and care workers?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight this amazing achievement. It reflects on the phenomenal effort of our frontline health and care workers, but also more broadly, the partnership we have seen at work in this country over the past year between the public sector, the private sector, the voluntary and charitable sector, and ordinary members of the public, all working together in a joint effort to beat this disease. So she's absolutely right to highlight it.
Let's go to Debbie Abrahams. Debbie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as much as I have a high personal regard for the Minister, he is incorrect in his remarks. The High Court ruling last Friday made it absolutely clear that at the time of the Prime Minister's response to honourable and right honourable members in this House last month, 100 contracts had not been published. They were outstanding. Whether intentional or not, the Prime Minister factually untrue. He needs to come to this place with a fulsome apology as warranted by the Minister's code.
Minister,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I lost a few words of the Honourable Lady's question there, but I think I know what she was asking, which was around the Prime Minister's remarks on the 22nd and how they implied. And can I start, first of all, by saying her kind words at the start are reciprocated. I've known her since I came to this House, and I have the highest regard for her as well. So I'm grateful for her kind words. In terms of the specifics she asked about in respect to the court judgment and in respect to the Prime Minister's regards, on the date the Prime Minister spoke, as I understand it, 100% of the contract awards notices, the details of the contracts, which are contained within them, were published. And that, I believe, is what my right honourable friend was referring to.
Right. We now go to Liz Twist. Liz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our NHS staff have made huge sacrifices during this pandemic and done all they can to support patients and their families. And now they're delivering a successful rollout of the vaccine. Does the Minister think it's fair for millions, in some cases billions of pounds, to be spent on contracts that don't deliver, but deny those same NHS staff the decent pay rise they need and deserve?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for the honourable lady's question. She's right to highlight the amazing work being done in the rollout of the vaccine by our frontline health and social care workers, and indeed many others, and I join her in paying tribute to them. I think what is important is that we worked flat out, and senior officials worked flat out, to make sure that the NHS and the frontline got what it needed last year, which was PPE to help keep them safe. And I have to say to the honourable lady, I hear the point she makes, but I do make no apology for the efforts that the government went to get the PPE in the quantities it was needed to keep our frontline safe.
Let's go to Selene Saxby. Selene.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The British people want us to focus on fighting this virus so we can protect our NHS as we roll out the vaccine and save lives. Does my honourable friend agree that the political sniping the opposition is engaging in is the exact opposite of what people expect and want to see politicians doing?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I think she alludes to the fact that I think what our constituents and what the public want to see is all of us in this House and all of us in government doing everything we can to make sure, as in the context of last year's procurement of PPE, that the front line got what it needed to keep it safe at the height of this pandemic. Transparency is, of course, hugely important. It's not an either-or, but the focus had to be on getting that PPE to the front line. She's absolutely right in the point she makes.
Let's go to Martin Docherty-Hughes. Martin.
Mr. Speaker, I believe in restorative justice, which requires the offender, that is the government, to accept responsibility for the harm it's caused to the principles of contractual openness and transparency. Can the Minister therefore advise the House, does the government, that is the offender in this case, accept responsibility for the judgment handed down by a court of law?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been clear both today and indeed when I came to this House 2 weeks ago that the government fully accepts and respects the judgment of the court.
Let's go to Robert Halfon. Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognise that the government has had to take urgent decisions when it comes to some of these contracts, especially when securing PPE at the height of the pandemic. But will the Minister ensure that any new UK health contracts are not agreed or signed unless the business concerned employs a significant amount of apprentices as part of their workforce, preferably higher than the public sector target of 2.3%?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, actually, I pay tribute to my right honourable friend for that question. I know it's something I think I started out in government as his PPS when he was the Apprenticeships Minister, and it's something that throughout his time in this House he has taken a huge and passionate interest in. I am very happy, and I'm sure colleagues in the Cabinet Office responsible for government procurement across the piece, I'm sure will be very happy to have a conversation with him about the point he's just made and to how greater use of apprenticeships can be baked into procurement decisions.
Let's go to Howell Williams. Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Initially, the Welsh Government anticipated an UK-wide approach to buying PPE. Then it took responsibility for its own procurement, but it still works with this government when the opportunity has arisen. Therefore, did the Secretary of State seek the agreement of the Welsh Labour Government before awarding any relevant contracts without competitive tendering or transparency? And did the Welsh Government itself raise any concerns about the lack of competition on its own initiative?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My understanding is that the procurement process for PPE rightly highlights was a UK procurement process. As he would have seen, we invoked Regulation 32, recognising the speed needed to meet the demand for PPE in the front line. And throughout this process, we worked at pace to ensure the focus was on the procurement of the PPE required. Throughout this process, throughout this pandemic, we have worked closely with the Welsh Government.
Shredberdley.
In the middle of an emergency, value for money goes out of the window, and I'm sure that terrible mistakes were made in the tendering process. But on the central charge that contracts were awarded to cronies, I'm mystified why this should have taken place if civil servants and not ministers took the decision. But does my honourable friend accept that the best way to resolve these issues is to take it out of party politics and let the National Audit Office get on with its job, and no doubt in time the PAC will issue coruscating reports, which are very wise with the benefit of hindsight.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my my right honourable friend. He's absolutely right to highlight that the decisions made, as I touched on, as the PAC was told, were made following an 8-stage process run by civil servants and not ministers. And he is also right that there has been no evidence found either by committees of this House, the NAO, or indeed in any court cases of any inappropriate involvement in terms of conflict of interest by ministers. To his final point, he's absolutely right, and I know that going forward, as we always do, the government will look to cooperate fully with the NAO in seeking to supply as much and any information as it seeks so that it can form its judgments and inform the PAC and this House indeed of them.
Let's go to Rachel Hopkins. Rachel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Back in December, and in the public interest and not just plain politics or sniping, myself and other MPs highlighted cronyism and waste in the government's pandemic procurement. So 3 months on from that Westminster Hall debate, would the Minister agree with me that responding then by increasing transparency reporting on those companies who won the £1.7 billion worth of contracts via the government's VIP fast lane and who were 10 times more likely to receive a contract would have been better than waiting to be taken to court?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady in respect of the appropriateness of contract awards and whether there were any conflicts of interest. I would refer her to the answer I've just given to my right honourable friend, the member for Gainsborough. But she talks about last December and the debate, I think in Westminster Hall, I could be wrong on that, where this was discussed. And I would point her to the point, the lines used by the judge in his judgment. The evidence as a whole suggests the backlog arose largely in the first few months of the pandemic and that officials began to bear down on it during the autumn of 2020. So at the time she was speaking of, in December, the judge acknowledged that the department and the government was working at pace to meet its transparency requirements. So that was already being done.
Let's go to Craig Whittaker. Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the teeth of the global pandemic and facing unprecedented global demand for vital supplies, does my right honourable friend agree with me that this government's ability to secure over 32 billion items of PPE, many items supplied from businesses in the Calder Valley and Leeds West, all stepping up to the plate, is a testament to the hard work and ingenuity of British businesses and should be celebrated?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend is absolutely spot on. He's right to highlight the amazing effort by British business and by businesses who stepped up in this country's hour of need to repurpose their production lines to source PPE. And indeed, I would include in that the work of my officials and officials in the Cabinet Office to make sure that it was bought, that it was procured and it was got to the front line. And just one statistic which alludes to exactly what he is saying, which is that we've moved from 1% of this country's needed PPE being produced in this country to 70% now, and that is testament to the amazing ingenuity and hard work of British business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, yesterday the Minister's Department answered a name day question I tabled on the 1st of December 2020 about some of its multi-million-pound contracts with management consultants. The government either has something to hide or they're staggeringly incompetent. So will the Minister see I get answers to the further questions on consultants tabled on the 19th of January? And will the government now support my Freedom of Information Extension Bill, which they blocked back in 2017, which would make private companies winning public contracts subject to the Freedom of Information Act?
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 points. On the latter, the government will always look very carefully at anything the honourable gentleman suggests to. On the former point, a very serious point, if he, after this session in the House, is able to let me know the WPQ numbers, I will endeavour to have them looked at and a response expedited for him.
Bob Stewart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Crisis situations such as the present pandemic often require action, not paper, and the ends can justify the means. Does the Minister agree with me that sending PPE out to users was the government's top priority, and getting right supporting paperwork, which can be filed later, should not jeopardise that speed of delivery.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to my honourable and gallant friend for his question. He's absolutely right to highlight that our number one priority, as I think the people of this country would expect, and as members of this House would expect, was in the face of an unprecedented demand for PPE. This government did everything it could to massively ramp up the supplies of PPE that were available and to get them to the front line. Of course, transparency is hugely important, and the court did find there was no policy to deprioritise compliance with transparency regulations and requirements. But he's absolutely right to highlight that the absolute priority must be to getting the kit to save lives.
Let's go to Zara Sultana. Zara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It has been revealed that almost £2 billion has been handed to Conservative Party friends and donors in dodgy COVID contracts. This includes the likes of Steve Parkin, who's donated more than £500,000 to the Conservatives. He's the chairman of Clipper Logistics, who awarded a £1.3 million PPE contract. Another Tory donor, David Mellor, has given £65,000 to the Tories over the past decade. His company, Mellor Designs, were awarded PPE contracts worth more than £150 million. These people didn't get rich, giving their money away for nothing. So my question is, does the Minister believe it's appropriate for the Conservative government to hand out fortunes, public money, to Conservative Party donors?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'd refer the honourable lady once again to the answer I gave to my right honourable friend, the member for Gainsborough, and I would also highlight that, to the best of my recollection, no court and no committee of this House has found any evidence of inappropriate conflicts of interest or inappropriate involvement by ministers in the award of contracts. And what I would say in conclusion to her is what matters here is whether companies supply what is needed to standard, and I would pay tribute to all companies who came on board, who stepped up, who did what was necessary to help us get the kit we needed to protect those in the front line.
Scott Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The vast majority of people in Blackpool can understand the exceptional circumstances which led to this paperwork being submitted slightly late. How many people does my honourable friend estimate came to direct harm because of a late submission of this paperwork, as opposed to those people who would have come to direct harm had PPE and medical supplies been delivered late?
Oh, good question. Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend makes an important point in his usual very forthright and clear way. The priority for this government and for those working for it was to get the PPE needed in the quantities needed to be able to get it to the front line to save lives. Transparency is important, of course it is, and I recognise that, and that's why we have worked since that time to get everything up to date in terms of transparency. But for me, I make no apologies for the amazing effort this government and those working for it, most importantly, the civil servants who did this work, put in to get the PPE in the quantities we needed it.
Let's go to Peter Graham. Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, despite the Minister's protestations and despite the huge amounts of money that were spent, the fact is that for those working in the social care part of health and social care, the equipment did not get anywhere near the front line, anywhere like on time. So I think the Minister is maybe glossing over the fact that although supplies to the health service seem to be okay, supplies to the social care sector were desperately inadequate. But the the Public Accounts Committee report that was endorsed by a committee, remember, which is a majority of government supporters on it, found that the department had wasted hundreds of millions of pounds on equipment that was of poor quality and can't be used. We were also told by the Cabinet Office that they didn't know how many contracts had essentially been approved after the work had started, how many contractors were only checked out for suitability after they had been given the contracts. Does the Minister not understand that all of this taken together creates a bad smell? And does he agree that the best way to get rid of that bad smell is to have everything published including assessments of conflict of interest, including information that in normal circumstances might be termed or deemed to be commercially confidential. Does he not understand that confidence in public procurement by the British government will...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'll endeavour to give a short answer to a long question. Two key points there. The Honourable Gentleman mentioned social care. He's right to do that. The focus of some of the questioning has been around the frontline, the NHS, but he's absolutely right to talk about social care. That's why we went from a supply chain where we were supplying PPE to 226 NHS trusts in England to 58,000 organisations, because historically social care settings have procured their own PPE on the open market. We recognise the pressures on that market, price pressures and demand pressures. That's why we expanded the supply chain to ensure that those that 58,000 settings ended up being able to access it. And on his final point, very briefly, he talked about money spent on contracts either where they were not fulfilled or where they did not meet the relevant quality criteria. I've already set out to the House the steps that the government is taking to review and audit those, and we will recoup money where appropriate to do so.
Let's go to Michael Fabricant. Michael.
Mr. Speaker, do you recall photographs back in the dark days of March, April and May last year of nurses wearing bin liners, photographs taken in Spain, Italy and the United States? In fact, if I hadn't been banned from having the backdrop of Lichfield Cathedral on Zoom, I could actually pop up these photographs from the New York Times to you. So can I ask my honourable friend, the Minister, does he not agree with me that the priority must be for the delivery of the PPE, and that these rather unpleasant Labour slurs actually do no good at all?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to see my right honourable friend. I hope it won't be too long before we see him in person in this House again. He's absolutely right to highlight the overall priority being to get the PPE to the front line. He highlights very clearly the situation we were seeing on our television every day, for example, from hospitals in Bergamo and elsewhere, the real challenges. That was the context at that time in Europe. We moved heaven and earth to try to get the PPE that was needed in time. We did not run out of PPE in this country, but it would be fair to say there were shortages in particular situations which were met by the government through the national shortage response. But it was in that context we had to do everything we possibly could, and I pay tribute to the officials who did it, to procure PPE in bulk in an incredibly overheated and challenging global market.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister rightly said transparency matters. So when will the government publish the full details or criteria of how businesses got into the fast lane?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I alluded to in the previous occasion I came to this House to answer questions on this matter, we set out that some contracts were put forward by members of this House, by members of other houses, of the other place, I should say, and were assessed through the fast-track priority lane. But there was no difference in the approach taken, the 8 stages that all of those contracts had to pass through to be awarded. They were all assessed independently by civil servants, so they all went through the same process. And those contracts that were awarded and which met the rules for the contract award notices publication will be published and have been published under the CAN regulations and on the website.
Let's go to Alexander Stafford. Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the start of this pandemic, just 1% of PPE in the UK was made here in this country. Now 70% of it is made in the UK, which is a huge achievement. Does my honourable friend agree that our rapid response to procuring and delivering PPE to frontline workers has been essential in keeping them and the lives of others safe? And will he work even harder to increase this percentage so even more PPE is made in the UK, perhaps by focusing on those areas with a textile heritage, such as in Thurcroft and Dinnington here in Rother Valley?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. Going from a capacity to produce PPE in this country of 1% to a capacity by our businesses to produce 70% of this country's PPE going forward is an incredible achievement, but he's absolutely right. We mustn't rest on our laurels. We must continue to work with British business to allow it to continue to innovate, to continue to develop its ability to meet UK need, and I pay tribute to the businesses in his constituency of Rother Valley for the work they did in helping out this country when it most needed it.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The simple truth is, Minister, that businesses up and down the country feel as though they were misled by the government. They were encouraged to get behind the PPE challenge. They invested in capital, expanding their capacity to manufacture. Yet we know that government middlemen mates were 10 times more likely than they were to win contracts. So can the Minister just set out when he will publish details of all the contracts, including when the businesses, the principal businesses, were established and what the duration of the contracts are?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government will meet its legal obligations to publish contracts under Regulation 50 and the requirements that that places on us for the information that needs to be published. Those that meet the criteria for a CAN, a contract award notice under that, that have been awarded by the Department of Health and Social Care directly, have been published. All contracts will be published, all details under CANs will be published where that is required by the regulation, and the information specified as to what's published in a CAN notice is of a standard format. We will continue to meet that obligation.
Let's go to Mike Wood. Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my honourable friend accept the findings of the Independent National Audit Office, who found that no health trust in the UK went without the PPE they needed, and that's in contrast with many other countries? My constituents in Dudley South rightly expect transparency in procurement, but most would never want pursuing paperwork to be prioritised over providing proper protective equipment.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is absolutely right that I think the people of this country would expect the government's #1 priority, as it was when we look back to March, April, May of last year, to move heaven and earth to get the PPE that was needed in a very challenging environment to the front line. I think what he's alluding to in the context of the NAO report was paragraph 18 of the summary, where it highlighted the NHS provider organisations we spoke to told us that while they were concerned about the low stocks of PPE, they were always able to get what they needed in time. It's not necessarily an NAO conclusion, but it is a reflection of what they were told and cited in this report, so he's right to highlight it.
Let's go to Marion Fellows. Marion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Ministerial Emergency Powers Bill, introduced by my friend, the Honourable Member for Midlothian, which would require ministers to answer questions in Parliament about any personal, political or financial connections they have to companies who are given government contracts, will now go forward to a second reading, which I hope the government will support, as this bill should help with the government's present court and publication difficulties. Would the Minister agree with me? It's crucial we get greater scrutiny and have stringent regulations in order to increase transparency on the issuing of government contracts and to ensure that the right people or companies are getting government contracts during these difficult times.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable lady. I've highlighted just how important I consider transparency to be, and second time in 2 weeks, quite rightly, I've been answering at the dispatch box, so I would argue that there is scrutiny there. And to her final point about her honourable friend's private member's bill, I know the government will look at it as they would look at any private member's bill in the usual way.
Let's go to Kim Johnson. Kim.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nurses have seen us through this crisis, putting their lives on the line every single day, yet the Prime Minister has only offered a derogatory 1% pay rise, but handed out billions to private companies that did not provide what was needed and to standard. And I remind you of the 400,000 substandard gowns from Turkey. So does the Minister agree that this is a kick in the teeth from this government, that the government has chosen to waste $37 billion to Serco for a failed track and trace system while denying our incredible nurses the pay rise that they deserve? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What this government has done and did in the context of the issues under discussion in this specific question is recognise the huge need for PPE in the context of the pandemic last year and took every possible step it could to meet that need. It secured a large number of contracts which delivered 8.8 billion pieces of PPE to date. I think that's called delivering.
Let's go to Peter Gibson. Peter Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More than 70% of PPE is now made in the UK compared to less than 1% before the pandemic. Coupled with the expansion of over 22,000 ventilators, this government has done an incredible job. Does my honourable friend agree that the petty point scoring of the party opposite is not what we need at this time of national emergency?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, I think I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I think I've set out in my answers that what I think is most important for this country is that we work together as we did in this contract, public sector, private sector, in this context, public sector, private sector, voluntary sector, and the great British public. We have pulled together and done everything we can, including, as he alludes to, building that capacity for UK businesses to meet more of our need for PPE. I think that is a great success for those businesses, and I pay tribute to them.
Chris Bryan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is adorable, but I'm not falling for that old trick. The truth of the matter is that the government didn't even get PPE out fast enough to people who really needed it, especially in our care homes, which is why so many people died, and we have the highest excess death rate of any country in the world. So I'm not taking any of this nonsense about they had to focus on that, which meant that they couldn't deal with transparency. The truth is what they set up was a VIP track for some people to be able to get massive contracts, and some people enriched themselves phenomenally during this pandemic, and many of them, surprise, surprise, happen to be Conservative Party donors. It looks, I have to say, like corruption, and the only way that the government can wipe that slate clean is if it comes clean with all the contracts, because otherwise it just looks like a cover-up.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, before turning to the right honourable gentleman's comments, I'll take his first comment, I think, as a compliment from a colleague I know well. But I have to say, having said that, I do not recognise his characterisation of what happens. He is right that there were challenges faced not just in frontline NHS situations, but in social care. He's absolutely right to highlight that, as I alluded to earlier, and that is why we increased the number of organisations from 226 to 58,000 that we were able to supply centrally. That is why we massively ramped up the purchases of PPE and the stocks of PPE that were available to get to the front line, to ensure that they could access what they needed to keep them safe. And on a final point, he mentions the assessments of the contracts and how they were awarded. I would merely take him back to, very gently, the point I made to the Right Honourable Member for Gainsborough, which is that these contracts, as set out to the Public Accounts Committee, went through an 8-stage assessment process undertaken by civil servants. I know he would not be, I'm sure, impugning the integrity of those civil servants. I know he has great respect for the civil servant, but I would say very gently that there has been no evidence cited, no findings in court of any minister in terms of conflicts of interest or having behaved inappropriately.
Jacob.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Throughout the pandemic, the government, the NHS, the armed forces have focused on saving as many lives as possible, while the Labour Party have focused on this sort of hindsight and political games. Saving lives meant securing as much PPE as possible, as fast as possible. So can he confirm that all those PPE contract notices that faced a short delay in publication are now in the public domain?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I can confirm that the contract award notices for the contracts here, the PPE contracts and similar, awarded directly by the department, are now in the public domain.
Let's go to Deirdre. Deirdre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister tell us how much was paid out under the contracts in advance of delivery? How much has actually been clawed back for services or products not delivered? And how much is the government still to pursue in repayments?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, I refer the honourable lady to the answer I gave to the honourable gentleman, the member for Strangford, as part of the answer to her question. In response to the rest of her question, the honest answer is we are undertaking a stocktake and an audit. It is that which is required to assess whether any stockpiles are not fit for purpose or do not meet requirements, or to check what was and wasn't delivered and make sure that every order was fully fulfilled. And we've been very clear that as part of that audit, as part of that stocktake, we will pursue with any who did not meet the requirements or did not supply